It says that on Sukkot you're supposed to do everything you do in the sukkah that you usually do at home. We eat at home, so we eat in the sukkah. Many people sleep in the sukkah because they sleep at home. And we also learn Torah in the sukkah. Whenever we learn here. And today we're learning a chapter of Rambam, so beautiful, beautiful zach. Okay. Hilchos Chametz Umatzah Perek Shishi. The laws of Chametz and Matzah, chapter 6. And today the topic is Matzah. We learned about Chametz for the last couple of days. Now it's time to turn to Matzah. And we're going to learn about which Matzah we're able to use on Pesach and which Matzah we're not able to use on Pesach. So the Rambam begins, Halacha Aleph. Mitzvah sasei min haTorah, lechol matzah beleil chamisha asar. It's a biblical commandment, positive commandment, to eat matzah on the night of the 15th of Nisan. Shenemar, as it says, bo'erev toichlu matzos. In the evening, you shall eat matzah. Actually, if you look at the verse, it's a mixture of two halves of the verse. Barishon ba'arba'a asar yom lachodesh ba'erev. On the first month, on the 14th day of the month, in the evening, kama tochlu matzot. You shall eat matzah. So you see that if you combine those red words together, ba'erev tochlu matzot. In the evening, you shall eat matzah. B'chol makom u'v'chol zman. And this applies in every place and every time period. Because on Pesach there's also another mitzvah, to bring a Passover sacrifice. But that only applies in the times of the temple, of course, when we can bring the sacrifices. So somebody might be led to think that you only have to eat matzah when you bring the Korban Pesach. Therefore it's in a separate verse. This verse doesn't talk at all about the Korban Pesach. That's how we know we have to eat matzah even nowadays. The Torah didn't depend the mitzvah of this eating on eating the Korban Pesach. Elazu mitzvah bifnei atzma, it's a mitzvah on its own. Umitzvasa kol halayla, and the mitzvah is all night. From the moment that nightfall begins till the end of the night, if you didn't have a chance to make the Seder early, you make the Seder later, you can eat the matzah all night. Aval bishar haregel, but the rest of Pesach, the rest of the 7 days in Israel, or 8 days outside of Israel, achilas matzah reshus. Eating matzah is optional. You don't have to eat matzah every day. Rotza oichel matzah. If you want, you can eat matzah, sure. Rotza oichel oirez oidoichan oikloyer seiperes. If you want, you don't have to eat any bread. You can eat rice, or millet, or toasted grain, or fruit. The Rambam was talking about in times of old. Today, of course, Ashkenazim don't eat rice or beans, kitniot, but that's not because it's a problem inherently. It's just because they used to be mixed with wheat, and it became a whole issue in earlier generations. But technically, what the Rambam is saying is you don't have to eat bread on Pesach. Matzah, that is. You can eat chicken and fruit the whole Pesach, as many people actually do.
And no bread at all.
No bread at all then, yeah, exactly, because you can't have bread because it's chametz, but you don't have to have matzah either. Aval beleil chamisha asar bilvad chayva. On the night of the 15th, the first night of Pesach, that's when it's an obligation. Umisha achal kazayis yotza yedei chayvase. Once you eat a kazayit, an olive-sized volume of matzah, which is about today, if you look at today's shmura matzahs, it's about a half or a third of a matzah, you fulfill your obligation.
I didn't like it so much, but no, that's all you have to eat is your kazayit.
Yeah, that's all you have to eat.
But I love this stuff, so you know.
Okay, if you love it, eat more, of course. I mean, nobody's stopping you. Beis, bala matzah yotza. What if you just swallowed the matzah? You didn't chew it and taste it. You just put it down your throat. The Rambam says you fulfill your obligation. There's no mitzvah to taste the matzah necessarily. You have to just eat it, ingest it. Bala maror lo yotza. But if you swallow the maror without tasting it, there you're not fulfilling your obligation. Why? Because the maror is all about remembering the bitterness. So if you don't taste the bitterness, you haven't fulfilled your obligation. Bala matzah u maror ke'echad. What about if you swallow matzah and maror together? So here, there's an interesting concept. The Rambam says, even though you did only one act, you swallowed matzah and maror sandwich together, yedei matzah yotza, yedei maror lo yotza. You fulfilled the obligation of matzah, and you didn't fulfill the obligation of maror. In other words, they stand alone. Even though in many cases in halacha, when two things come together, they can disturb each other. So if there's a problem in one, it will create a problem in the other. Here, we look at them separately. The matzah has no problem, the maror has its problems. Why? Why is the matzah okay, the maror not okay? Shehamaror kitfela lematzah. The Rambam says the maror is considered to be secondary to the matzah. So whatever's more important takes precedence. Since the matzah is the most important, that's what we pay attention to, and you fulfill your obligation for the matzah, but not for the maror. Krachan b'siv v'chayotze bayu blan. What if you wrapped the matzah and the maror in some edible fiber.
Lettuce? I mean, what?
No, lettuce would be maror itself. Let's just say you have some kind of an edible herb, maybe like seaweed. Think of seaweed, right? Something like that. And you would wrap the matzah and the maror in it, and you're a professional swallower, so you stick it down your throat in a way that neither the matzah or the maror touched your digestive tract. Just went with the seaweed right down. Af yedei matzah lo yotza. So then in that case, even matzah, you don't fulfill your obligation. Even though you don't have to taste the matzah, but you have to be able to taste it. In other words, it has to be going down your system in a normal way, but not wrapped in something else, in which case that will disturb the matzah from fulfilling your obligation. Exactly. The hot dogs contest, I was looking actually for a picture of that. I couldn't find one. But if you like that kind of a contest where you just stuck it down your throat, so then you're good. Then you're not good for the matzah.
Or maror.
Well, maror for sure not, yeah. Gimel, ochal matzah b'loi kavana. If you ate matzah without intent, you didn't intend to do the mitzvah. You figured, it's a good cracker, I'll have it for dinner. Even if you knew tonight was Pesach, and there's a mitzvah to eat matzah, let's say you're a very educated Jew, but you're not doing it to fulfill the mitzvah. You're eating matzah because you like crackers. Or, the Rambam says, Kegoin sha'anasuhu akum eilistin lechel. Somebody forced it down your throat. An idol-worshipping Gentile forced matzah down your throat. An armed robber forced it down your throat. Yatsa yedei chayvasa. You've nevertheless fulfilled your obligation. It's a big discussion in halacha, if mitzvot tzrichot kavana. If when you do a deed of a mitzvah, you have to be intending to fulfill the mitzvah. The Rambam over here, at least in the laws of matzah, seems to rule that it's not required. Ochal kazayis matzah v'hu nichpe be'eis shtusai. What if you ate the matzah in a state of delirium? A person has epilepsy, is in the middle of a fit, and he chucks some matzah in his mouth during the seizure. The achar kach nisrape, and then he comes back to himself. Chayav lechol achar shenisrape. He has to eat another round of matzah again in a healthy state of mind. Because the moment that he ate the first time, he was in a state where he was exempt from mitzvahs. And so, it's not like eating matzah under duress. When you eat matzah under duress, you're in a state where you're obligated to do the mitzvah. You just ate it in a wrong way. Here, you weren't even liable, you weren't even accountable to do the mitzvah, therefore you're exempt. And therefore you have to eat it again after you become healthy. Dalid, ein adam yaitze yedei chayvas achilas matzah. A person only fulfills his obligation to eat matzah eloim kein achala me'echad mechameshes haminin. Only if he ate it from a grain made from one of the 5 grains: wheat, barley, oats, spelt, or rye. Shenemar. How do we know this? Very interesting verse. Look at this. It says, Lo yisoichal olav chametz, shivas yamim toichal olav matzahs. Don't eat any chametz on Pesach. Instead, for 7 days, eat matzah. So since the Torah puts together chametz and matzah, so we learn from this, dvarim habayim lidei chimutz, only things which could become chametz potentially, im achalan matzah yatsa b'han yedei chayvasai. You fulfill your obligation when you eat matzah made out of them. So wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye are the only 5 grains which can become chametz, and therefore they're the only ones which can be used to create matzah. Avol sha'ar dvarim, but any other grain, rice, millet, legumes, ein yotze b'han yedei matzah. You cannot, if you created matzah out of rice matzah, you wouldn't fulfill your obligation. Because they cannot become chametz.
But spelt matzah, it says, is not good for Seder. Some of the matzahs that are up with some of these other grains, they say it's not.
If they say it's not good for Seder on the box, that would be because they were cooked with other liquids other than water, for a different reason. The grain itself is kosher.
So
you had spelt matzah. Yeah, my brother used to have spelt matzah as a kid.
Really?
Yeah, proper spelt matzah. just spelt flour and water. That's it.
Okay.
But if you're putting in apple juice and whatnot, then you have other issues.
Okay.
And also, you got to be super careful because some of the boxes they sell it in the Passover section of some.
Yes, and they're not kosher for Passover.
And it looks exactly everything. In tiny little writing, it says not kosher for Passover.
It's a big deal.
It's a scam.
It's a big scam.
Yeah, there's a lot of these companies that don't.
They're trying to do matzah. The Jews are trying to do matzah. They buy a matzah off the shelf, and they're cheated out of it.
Yeah, it happened to me, and luckily before I opened the box, I was reading it, and I'm like, hold on a second.
There you go.
Yeah.
Buy from Chabad.
Buy from Chabad only. Exactly.
Only shmura.
Only shmur. The round matzah, that's it. You can't go wrong with that. Hey, ha'isa isa min hachitim umin ha'irez. What if you make a dough of a mixture, both wheat flour and rice flour together? Im yesh batam dagan yetze vayedei chevasei. If the apparent taste tastes like grain, tastes like wheat, you fulfill your obligation. Isas haklavim, dog's dough. Okay, we'll soon see a little bit more about what this is. But basically, it's a dough that was made with the entire grain, but not as refined as today's whole wheat bread. Think about like literally opening up your bread and having pieces of bran in it. It was like a very,
Was it still on the
a real whole grain. So it used to be typically fed to animals. But the Rambam says, Bizman sheharoyim oichlin mimena, if you see the shepherds, the ones that are in charge of the dogs, the dog sitters, if they're also snacking from this dough, that means yotze bo yedei chayvasa. You can fulfill your obligation. If you made matzah from that, it means it's fit for human consumption. People can eat it. Ein haroyim oichlin mimena, but if no shepherds are eating, they only give it to the dogs. Ein yotze, but then you cannot fulfill your obligation with it. She'ein zu mishumeres l'shem matzah, because that's not guarded. Matzah shmura means it has to also be guarded only for matzah. Here, it's only used for dogs. It's not used for human consumption. Matzah shalosha b'mei peiros. What about if you made matzah with fruit juice? Fascinatingly, the Rambam holds that you're allowed to fulfill your obligation with matzah and fruit juice. In other words, if you mixed flour with apple juice and you made matzah, that's okay. Certain liquids are forbidden. Wine, oil, milk, those you cannot make matzah with. Mishum lechem oini, because it has to be poor bread. It's the same verse as before, but now I highlighted other words. See, lechem oni, matzah has to be poor man's bread. If you make matzah out of wine or oil or milk, it's not poor, it's called rich matzah, as we've explained in the last chapter. If you kneaded the dough and you ate such a matzah, you haven't fulfilled your obligation, go back, find some other matzah.
Egg matzah, no good?
Egg matzah, no good. You cannot fulfill your obligation with bread made out of coarse bran or refined bran. Here, this is a bran bread. Okay, so you have the dough on the left side. You can see literally the pieces are in there. And then even in the dough as it's baked, it almost looks like it's half crunchy because it has all those pieces in it. So if you made matzah, this is not matzah, it's of course chametz, but if you made a thin matzah out of it, you can fulfill your obligation of matzah. What you could do is you can make a dough out of the whole thing, the flour and the bran inside of it, make it into bread, and fulfill your obligation. Also, if you made a bread out of extremely refined flour. Today it's not a novelty, everyone's flour is super fine. But in those days it was a big achievement to get really, really fine flour. So if you did, it's permitted. You can use it for matzah, you fulfill your obligation on Pesach. We don't say it's not poor man's bread. No, poor man could also have refined flour once in a while.
Can you bake matzah during Passover?
You could, technically. They used to, in fact.
But you
Today we don't.
I understand what you do, but I know that today. But it's contradicting because you do have flour in your house.
You can have flour in your house.
Yeah,
Flour and water can't mix for more than 18 minutes.
then they become chametz.
So you can have flour
Look, I'll tell you what. Today's flour that you buy in stores, many people don't know it, but it's actually already mixed with water. Part of the way that they refine the flour that you buy in the store, they already put it through water, settle it, and so it's literally chametz. That flour is chametz for other reasons. It's chametz in and of itself. But if you were a farmer and you made your own flour, then technically you could have it at home. All Jews used to make their own matzah on Passover. Matzah didn't last more than a day. It's industrial, exactly. Today we have matzah because it's.
And they would make it during Chol Hamoed, obviously,
Of course,
for each day.
but it was very complicated in all the laws. You have a certain oven, you have to draw the water the day before, and it's a whole. That's why today we just avoid it. You give it to the matzah bakeries, they make the matzah.
There you go.
All right, vav echad matzah shenefes betanur or beilpas. Doesn't matter whether you bake the matzah in an oven or in a pan. Bein shehidbik habatzik beilpas v'achar kach hirtiach. Whether you put the dough into the pan first and then lit the fire, bein shehirtiach v'achar kach hidbik, or you lit the fire first and then you put the matzah onto the pan. Afilu afa bakarka, even if you baked matzah on the ground, on hot earth, you can fulfill your obligation with such matzah. Also, if the matzah wasn't fully baked, you can use it for the obligation. But you have to make sure that it's not stringy. Like this is chametz, not matzah, but you have a bread, right? You pull it apart, and there's those strings of dough that are literally coming apart. So if you crack the matzah and it's coming apart like that, that's too raw. The matzah has to be fully baked. Now today it's almost impossible because today we have very, very thin matzahs. You crack them, they're for sure going to crack. But in the olden days, we're talking about making matzah at home. we learned yesterday that as long as your hands are occupying on the dough, it never becomes chametz. The 18 minutes that we know about for chametz doesn't start till you let go of the dough. So if you're at home and you're baking your own matzah, you can go with the dough for hours and kneading it, and then make a nice little lafa for matzah.
Well, like the soft matzah.
Like the soft matzah, exactly. And that's all Jews used to have that. So therefore, the Rambam's talking about, cracking it with stringy dough, because it was very possible that your matzah would be that way. Can we get a selfie? Oh. Schmack.
Good stuff.
Okay. Let's see. Weiter. V'yotzin berakik hashoroi. Ooh, Chabad people are not going to like this one. You can fulfill your obligation with matzah that was soaked in water. Today, Chabad is crazy about gebruks. We don't let the matzah touch even the tiniest bit of water. But technically, you can soak your matzah in water and fulfill your obligation. Again, the truth is that the whole Chabad custom only began in recent generations when matzah became industrialized. As long as people were making matzah at home and you could knead the dough properly, there was no issue. Because there was no worry that any part of the matzah was unbaked. When matzah became industrialized, people were mixing matzah so fast to create millions of pounds to provide for all the Jews. There was a worry that some flour would be left not needed, and later on, if it would touch water, it could become chametz. That's where the whole gebrux comes from. Yeah. So in the Rambam's times, there was no gebrux.
They were eating matzah brei.
Absolutely. So you can use a soaked matzah with no problem. V'hu shaloini moyach, so long as it doesn't dissolve. Aval matzah shebishla, but if you cooked matzah, let's say you first baked it in the oven, then you put it in a pot. So when you eat that, that's not fulfilling your obligation. There's no taste of bread. The bread is out when you cook matzah after baking it. You cannot fulfill your obligation using matzah which is forbidden to be eaten. We love this slide. Comes up every other chapter. When a farmer brings home produce from his field, it's automatically called tevel. It's called untithed. Until you give a bunch of things. Teruma, 2% to the Kohen. Maaser Rishon, 10% to the Levi, of which he has to give 1% to the Kohen. And then a second tithe, which goes either to Jerusalem or to the poor. So if you brought in, this is apples. Let's say there was wheat in this picture, okay? You brought home your wheat, and you didn't give the proper presents to the Kohen and to the Levi, and you made matzah out of the grain, it's tevel. You can't use that matzah. Oy Maaser Rishon, shaloi nitla trumasai. Or, let's say you gave your 10% to the Levi, and he makes matzah out of his 10% without giving his 1% to the Kohen. It's forbidden food. Or you stole some wheat. You went to your neighbor's field and you stole some flour and you made matzah. Stolen matzah.
It just has to be separated.
Yes. So any forbidden matzah you cannot use. There's a big principle in halacha called mitzvah haba'a ba'avera. We don't do mitzvahs that come with sins. Actually, on Sukkot, there's a big topic about it. If you steal somebody's lulav and you make a blessing, does that work? You steal somebody's lulav and you make a blessing. Does it work?
No, because it's yours.
No, because it's a mitzvah that came through a sin.
Also,
Okay.
If you're going to use somebody else's, it has to be like a Kenyan, right?
Yes, it has to be a gift, acquired. Zeh haklal. This is the guiding principle. Any bread upon which you can recite grace after meals, you can use for matzah. If it's bread that you don't use for birkat hamazon, you cannot fulfill your obligation for matzah. Kohanim can use any gift which they receive. Whenever a person makes a dough, he would take challah, give it to a Kohen. Crop 2% of truma to the Kohen. The Kohen can then take this grain and make matzah for himself. Even though not everybody else can eat it, only a Kohen can eat it. Doesn't matter, for him it's good, he can eat it. You can also fulfill your obligation with matzah of the second tithe. After you take 2% to the Kohen and 10% to the Levi, you take another 10%, take it to Jerusalem, and you can only eat it in Jerusalem. So if you had wheat and you made flour and matzah out of that maaser sheni, you can use it on Pesach. But you cannot use matzah out of the first fruit. The 7 types of fruit Israel was blessed with. And each year, the first ones would go to the temple to the Kohen. So that you cannot use for matzah. Because bikurim cannot be eaten everywhere. Maser Sheni, Efshar Sheyi Padavi Achal B'chal Makom. The second tithe, we'll see in the 7th book of the Rambam, you're able to redeem, transfer the holiness onto other produce or money, and end up eating the produce anywhere. But Bikurim cannot be eaten anywhere, only in Jerusalem. What's the problem with that? The Kasuv, it's written as follows. In the verse it says, B'chol moshvesechem toichlu matzah. So you have to eat matzah in all of your settlements. From which we learn, matzah haru'uya lehi achel b'chol ha'moshavos, hu sheyetzin b'yedei chayva. Only matzah, which can be eaten everywhere, can be used to fulfill your obligation. Since Bikurim can only be eaten in Yerushalayim, you can't use it. Tes chalois toida urikike nazir she'asu oisan la'atzman. The loaves that were used in a Thanksgiving offering. If somebody today, we say hagomel, whenever you go on a plane ride overseas or you get sick. In temple times, whenever you went through one of those circumstances, you brought a special sacrifice, a Thanksgiving offering. And it came along with 40 loaves. 30 of them were chametz, 10 of them were matzah. So let's say a person has to give a Thanksgiving offering, and he made himself these loaves. Or Nazir, a person took a Nazirite vow, and at the end of his term, you also have to bring many sacrifices, some of which were loaves. Some chametz, some matzah. Sha'asu otan la'atzman. If the person made it for himself, for his sacrifice, and then he changes his mind, he goes, you know what, Pesach is coming, I want to use the matzah for my Seder. Ein yotzin bahen. You cannot use them for the Seder. They have to be designated for that purpose. Shenemar u'shmarta mes ha'matzah. So it says you have to guard the matzah. Matzah ha'mishtameres le'inyan matzah bilvad hu sheyetzin ba. Only matzah which is guarded for matzah, you can use. Avol zu mishtameres le'inyan hazevach. This one is being used for a sacrifice. That's no good. If you made those loaves to sell in the market to other people who have to bring offerings to buy from you, you're the baker. Then you can change your mind and take some loaves home and use for your Seder. Because anybody who makes stuff to sell in the market, daitoi, always has in mind that if he doesn't sell, he'll bring it home and eat it. Which means that when the time that he made them, he was already thinking about matzah, and therefore it's okay. Yud, hakol chayavin ba'achilas matzah. Every Jew is obligated to eat matzah on Pesach. Afilu nashim va'avadim, even women, even slaves. Katan sheyachal lechol pas, even a child who can eat bread. He's old enough to eat bread. We educate him in mitzvahs, and we feed him a kazayat of matzah. Old man or a sick person who cannot eat, he can't ingest all the matzah. Here again, we soak some matzah in water, put it under the sink, and you feed him the matzah. Again, it cannot dissolve. It has to be wet, but not dissolved. Yud Aleph, Midivrei Sofrim, rabbinically we have a rule, she'ein maftirin achar matzah klum, that after you eat the final matzah at the Seder, what we call today the afikoman, you don't eat anything afterwards. Even like desserts, toasted grains, walnuts, treats, you don't have. Ela afal pisha achal matzah. Even if you ate matzah at the Seder, and you ate other foods, you had the meal, chicken and soup, whatever, and fruit. You always end the meal on Pesach night with matzah. Go back and eat some more matzah, and then you stop. Yud Beis, Asru Chachamim lechol matzah be'erev Pesach. The sages forbade us to eat matzah on the day before Pesach. So there should be a recognition, it should be a distinction that you're eating matzah at night. Somebody who ate matzah on the eve of Pesach, the Talmud calls it's like somebody who has relations with his betrothed bride before they get married in the home of his father-in-law. It's like a super high-level violation. And the rabbis can give you rabbinic lashes till your soul expires. It's a very big issue, which, by the way, for American people becomes a big problem. Because many people make seders early, before nightfall. Right. So besides the fact that you lose the mitzvah of eating matzah in nighttime, you also end up eating matzah on Erev Pesach. So you get two problems. So you have to tell your friends to make nightfall, only the Seder at nightfall. You also cannot eat any meal. Forget matzah. You can't eat a full meal on Erev Pesach just before mincha time, but the last quarter of the day. So you go into eating matzah with an appetite. And you can eat a little bit of fruit or vegetables just to stave off your hunger, but don't fill up your belly with them. The earliest sages, they would purposely starve themselves on Erev Pesach, only eat in the morning and such. So be able to eat matzah with an appetite, and the mitzvah would be cherished they would love the mitzvah, it would be delicious. Avol bishara arve Shabbos say arve yamim tovim, but other eves of Shabbat or eves of holidays, that the problem is not so big. You can eat snacks till the nighttime. You shouldn't make a meal, but snacks are no problem. On Erev Pesach, there's something to be said about people who purposely make themselves hungry so they get matzah with an appetite.